We live obviously in very confusing times. For somebody really to understand what is happening, in many ways it's very difficult. You see, we all know what's happening in terms of the United States, in terms of Trump, in terms of, the opposition to him, in terms of the Biden election and so on, the whole concept of what Trump claims to be the fraudulent elections. The truth is that the United States is really in tremendous turmoil. And it's not just the United States. Israel has just announced, of course, that they are having a fourth round of elections, which of course indicates that Israel is in the same turmoil as everybody else. And of course there's the COVID, which is enormously disrupting, the flow of civilization. The question is, how do we understand this from a Torah perspective, or from a Hashkafa perspective? That is the question. Is it possible? And of course the answer is yes, because everything can be understood from the perspective of the divine agenda. We know that. The question, of course, is what is the divine agenda? And how does it explain really what is happening? So what I'd like to talk tonight is what I think is going on, what the divine agenda is, especially in today's time, and to show you that all of this really makes eminent sense based on the requirements and the recommendations or the necessities of the divine agenda itself. And I'm going to try to explain a great deal of ideas, and especially when you begin to ask yourself that what doesn't really make sense is if things were proceeding in a way which I have been saying for years actually, the whole concept of the messianic process proceeding, moving forward, then why does everything look as if it's stopped or interrupted or whatever you want to call it? What is happening? And what possibly will happen? So that's what I want to talk about tonight. In order to understand really what is happening, you always have to go back to the Chumash. And the Chumash really, of course, has everything in it. And there are many psukim, verses, that state what is happening, but of course in a very cryptic way. So what I'd like to do is go back to the Chumash and try to see, can we figure out the nature of the events happening based on certain parshiyos, certain sections of the Torah? And the answer, I think, will be, of course, is yes. So what I'd like to do is go to the parsha that I think reveals a great deal. And that is a parsha that we are all familiar with. It's Vayera, Parshas Vayera. It's at the end, and it's all about the Akedah. The Akedah, of course, is the binding of Yitzhak on the altar. And of course, Avraham Avinu, we know, was commanded by God to sacrifice, to slaughter Yitzhak. This is one of the pivotal ideas, of course, in Yom Kippur, where, like I say, Avraham Avinu is commanded to slaughter Yitzhak in deference to the commandment of God. Now, there are many things to be understood, obviously, about the Akedah, but I want to focus in on really three questions. And what I want to try to demonstrate is that these three questions really answer, to a great extent, what is happening today. So we begin to see that the Akedah, the story of the Akedah, has universal implications. First question. We know that Avraham Avinu had 10 tests, and this was the last, the Akedah, to sacrifice his son Yitzhak, because God apparently had commanded him to do so. This was the last test. Now, of course, we know that he passed all the tests. Avraham Avinu passed every single test. The question is, other than the fact that this test obviously wants to test the loyalty, the extraordinary loyalty that Avraham Avinu has toward the command of God, which he, of course, would have to demonstrate by sacrificing Yitzhak. The question is, we know it's the last test. Why this test? You see, what is the meaning that the form of this last test has to do with sacrificing Yitzhak? Now, of course, we know that never happened, because the Malach told him that God, of course, does not want you to do it, and therefore Yitzhak, of course, was freed. But is there any idea that we can fathom as to the real understanding or the profound understanding of why this test, the last test of Avraham Avinu, has to be in this form? So that's one question. Second question is, it says there, right? It says that, and Avraham Avinu, after the Malach told him that you cannot kill Yitzhak, it says that he looked around and he saw there was an idol, a ram, that was stuck, that was entangled in the bushes. And the Torah goes on to tell us that it was entangled not just in the bushes with his body or his legs, but it was entangled bekanov, with his horns. Why is that important? Just say Nes Nizbach that he was entangled. The ram was entangled, his body, whatever. What difference does it make how he was entangled? Bekanov, with his horns. Then the last question I want to ask is, it says that Avraham Avinu was looking around and he saw an idol, as I said, a ram, and it says that he offered up the ram li'oilo as a sacrifice, right, a burnt offering, right, tachas benoi. Instead of his son, he offered up this ram as an oilo, as a complete burnt offering. You see. Now, we would imagine what it just simply should have said, and he offered up this ram as an oilo, as a burnt offering. Why did it say tachas benoi instead of his son? It's first of all, it's obvious that it's instead of his son. And why is that important? Why is this phrase instead of his son important? Tachas benoi. And as we will see from the answer, these questions reveal extraordinary secrets of the end of time. What does that mean? As we will see, that this test of Avraham Avinu, which was the last test, really is the situation of the Jews at the end of time. And Avraham Avinu, in many ways, is supposed to have an input into this, and therefore he is giving a test which models itself after the situation of the Jews at the end of time. That's what we're going to see. Now, this is one parsha. Now, we find also a certain chazal, and that chazal also reveals a tremendous depth in terms of what is going to happen really at the end of time. Now it says in Meshech Sanhedrin that Ein ben David bo, that the Mashiach ben David does not come ela bedor, a generation that is either kulam chayom, they're all sinful, and therefore they're all obligated, they're all culpable or guilty, or kulam zakoim, or they're all guiltless, I should say, or innocent, or they're all righteous. So that chazal tells us something very important, that the situation of the end of time, is going to be a situation where the Jews are either all sinning, so they're all chayom, they're all guilty, and they're all culpable of guilt, of sin, or it's going to be filled with tzaddikim. You see. Now let's examine that, because that chazal tells us many profound ideas. First of all, it tells us that, like I said, that the situation that the Mashiach comes is going to be one of two types. The Jews will be in one of two situations. Like I say, either they will be all righteous. Now what does that mean? That means the overwhelming majority of Jews will be righteous. They will do mitzvahs, and if they sin, they will do tshuva. They will repent, you see. Or it could also indicate that this generation, right, the majority of Jews will be righteous, even if not all of them. But their righteousness will consist of that even if they sin, not only will they do mitzvahs, but even if they sin, right, they will do tshuva. They will repent. And there will be suffering, but in order to, atone for the sins, whatever that they don't do tshuva for or repent for, but that will be very minor. So that's the kulam zakoim, all righteous. And then we have the kulam chayovim. They will all be sinners, guilty, culpable of sinning. You see, what a contrast between the situation of Jews before the Mashiach comes. So the Mashiach can come either in situation A, which is zakoim, they're all righteous, or they're all chayovim, or they're all guilty of sinning. That would mean that it's a terrible situation, you see. And in one of these two situations, the Mashiach will come. Now, the question is, of course, what does that really exactly mean? What does it mean that kulam chayovim? We understand what kulam zakoim is, but what does kulam chayovim mean? What does that mean, really? Okay. Well, what it means is this. It tells us what type of a world we will be in when the Mashiach comes. Chayovim. What that means is basically two very basic ideas. One, you see, is that the world will have reached Memtes Shari Tumah, the 49 levels of defilement. Tumah, sinning. You see, that's what Chayov means. And that's why everybody basically is sinning. Because the world's environment is an environment of Memtes, the 49 levels of defilement. Now, there are 50 levels of defilement, okay? And to reach the 49th level is exceedingly dangerous. Because if you go into the 50th level, whatever that is, of tumah, of defilement, you cannot be redeemed. And we are going to learn this from Egypt. That in Egypt also the Jews, as Chazal tell us, were at the 49th level of tumah, of defilement, you see. And therefore, had they slipped into 50th, then God would not have redeemed them. So that's clearly, obviously, a very dangerous place to be, you see. Now, what does it mean that 49 levels of tumah? It means that the environment is such, the societies that exist at that time is such that there's an enormous amount of, as we will see, immorality and many other things which I will mention, you see. But we will be right at the level or the gate of the 50th level of tumah. And that is a crisis of terrible proportions, because what that means is that tikkun is not possible. I mean, if everybody is sinning, if this is a generation where we are at the 49th level of tumah, of defilement, right, then what tikkun, what rectification can the Jews be doing, you see? In fact, in that type of generation, Judaism itself is going to disappear, or is on the brink of disappearing. Not Jews, but Judaism, you see. That, as I say, is at the brink of completely vanishing, disappearing, in that type of situation. And like I said, that is a terrible crisis, because at that point in time, tikkun will have stopped. To rectify the creation by doing the will of God will have stopped, which obviously is very bad. And the worst thing is that it can very easily lead to the nun shari tumah, the 50th gate of defilement, and then redemption at that level is not possible. Well, first of all, what does it mean that the environment will be at the 50th level of, or the 49th level of defilement? Well, first of all, materialism. The world will be completely steeped in materialism. That's basically what it's all about. Not spirituality, you see, or religion, but materialism. Then there will be a great deal of atheism, where many people just don't even believe in God or in any spiritual type of force. Pleasure, taiva, will be rampant. The main goals of mankind will be to pursue pleasure, you see. That will be the main goals. Not only that, but we'll have immorality. Tremendous amount of what's called zimo, immorality or sexual promiscuity, you see, and so on. But besides that, in other words, the world will be in a very immoral place. Besides that, there will be sexual perversions. It's what's called mishkav zocha. Tremendous amount of, like I say, perversions, homosexuality, and so on, to such an extent where it's possible for a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman. You see, those are tremendous perversions of the natural order, and that will be a tremendous degree of immorality, and that's what will happen. But the morality at that time will not just be the immorality, but it will be legitimatized. It will be acceptable as a social norm, you see, and it will pervade society in all forms of educational material, you see, and an accepted value among the peoples of the world. This is what it means to be in the 49th level of Tumah. And guess what? As we see from America, it's exactly where we are, you see. In many ways, you can compare the world to Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah, as they say, you see. And these things were rampant in that society. Now, besides that, besides the environment of tremendous amount of tumah, in that environment, since it says Kulam Chayovim, the Jews will be in a situation where there will be a tremendous amount of sinning. In fact, of the approximately 14 million Jews today, basically 11 million Jews are gone. There's no mitzvah observance. There's no learning Torah, you see. They're gone. You know, how many times have I gone, let's say, to a city to speak or whatever? Many times. And I would ask, how many Jews are in this city? And they tell me, well, there are 80,000 Jews in this city, but only 2,000 Jews are observant. Can you imagine? 80,000 Jews are gone, and 2,000 Jews are observant. And this statistic was repeated to me time and time again when I would go to different cities. What does that tell you? And this was years ago. Today, I'm afraid to ask. But imagine 11 million Jews out of 14 million, or perhaps even 12 million. They're gone, totally gone, you see? And not only that, they say the statistics now is that 7 out of 10 Jews are intermarried. Their spouses are not Jewish. You see, that is a horrendous statistic. How long can the Jews survive with that type of statistic? You see, and then you have the assimilation. There are so many Jews that just live among the non-Jews, you know, and many of them don't even know they're Jewish. They certainly know any kind of observance of mitzvahs, right, commandments and Torah and so on. And then even of those Jews that are not assimilated, many of them are unaffiliated. They have nothing to do with any kind of Jewish organization. They've never been to Israel, you see. They certainly are not affiliated with any type of shul or synagogue, you see. So when you think about that, 11 million out of 14 million, for instance, that's 80% of the Jewish people have disappeared or are in the act of disappearing. So therefore, we are looking at Kulam Chayovim. That's basically that the Jews are basically sinning, you see, most of them. So in many ways, we understand what the Chazal tell us, that the generation before Mashiach comes will be a generation of which most of the Jews will be gone, disappear, and not only that, but the environment will be a terrible environment, you see. And we already know that there's no emes, there's no truth. The sheker, there's enormous amount of untruth, lies, distortions in the entire world. I'm not even going into countries that clearly illustrate this type of lifestyle. You see, the whole world is sheker, is filled with lies and distortions, untruths, and so on, I'm not even talking about the media that is so much fake news, and even in America. Look what goes on in America in terms of what the truth is, and how they represent the truth. So this is what the Chazal tell us. Therefore, what they're saying is something which is really very interesting. It's that the Mashiach will come to one of these two types of generations. Now, we therefore are in the generation of Chulim Chayovim, where most Jews are sinners in that sense, that they really have nothing to do with Judaism. You see, now that is an emergency generation crisis, because there's no tikkun going on. But the real danger is that this generation will slip into the nun, into the 50th generation, or rather the 50th level of tumah, of defilement. That's the real problem. And as we can see, in Egypt it was the exact problem, that the Jews in the time of Egypt, Mitzrayim, were in danger of slipping into the 50th. Now, therefore, what this means is the following. Avraham Avinu was given this last test, as we will see, to tell him that in the end of time, the Jews will be chayav misa, in the sense that they're not going to make it. They'll be subject to the death penalty or annihilation. And therefore to demonstrate that, you need to bring Yitzhak on the altar and sacrifice him. Because that's what it's going to be in the end of time. You see, just like Yitzhak has to be sacrificed, the Jewish people at the end of time will also be chayav, obligated to be sacrificed. They will be annihilated. And we'll certainly see that with a medrash that I'm going to quote. Okay? Therefore, this is the last test of Avraham Avinu, the Akedah, to illustrate that this will be the situation in the end of time of the Jewish people before the Mashiach comes. Therefore, it's a crisis. So therefore, a Malach now tells Avraham that you could take Yitzhak off. Yitzhak is redeemed. Wow. He survives. But wait a minute, you can't just survive, right, and leave behind the reasons for your annihilation. There has to be a substitute. There has to be what's called a tachas benoi. And that's why it says, right, and Avraham Avinu looked around for an oilah, right, and he brought it on the altar because he had taken Yitzhak off, and he sacrificed it, tachas benoi, instead of his son. In other words, that was the condition. The reason why you could take Yitzhak off the altar and not sacrifice him is because you have supplanted him. You have substituted him with a substitute, tachas benoi. Instead of Yitzhak, there's something else. Which tells us that if there was no idol, if there was no ram that Avraham Avinu could have used instead of Yitzhak, then Yitzhak would have to remain on the altar and be sacrificed. It's only because there was a tachas benoi, a substitute for Yitzhak, that he could be redeemed, you see. And therefore this substitute, that will be annihilated. Now that is a very profound understanding of what occurred, why the Akedah was the last test, and what enables Yitzhak to be redeemed. There has to be a tachas benoi. So even though we see a situation that the Jewish people can survive, there's something has to happen, you see, that will substitute and allow the Jews to survive. Now what that means is the following, that God, in order to do this, and therefore to stop the slaughter of Yitzhak, you see, or in order to stop the Jews from slipping into the 50th, in which case they cannot be redeemed, and they would just simply be annihilated. You see? God has to take what's called emergency measures, emergency actions that have to be taken. And I'm going to outline to you the 6 emergency measures that God has to take in order for the Jews to be redeemed, in order for Yitzhak to be taken off the altar. I'm going to try to illustrate to you the 6 measures that are the measures of Tachas B'nai. Instead of Yitzhak, there's something else that can supplant Yitzhak. And you will see that these measures are the exact measures that are happening today. Because in many ways, we are at the end of time. And the Mashiach is about to come. The problem is, like I said, is Kulam Chayovim. We live in a generation where everybody's chayav, where the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people have disappeared, or they are in the act of disappearing. Don't be fooled by the fact that you may live in neighborhoods where there are many Jewish people that do mitzvahs, and so on. The many places, in America, whether it be Borough Park or Flatbush or Lakewood and so on, Williamsburg, or Muncie, or in Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim and so on. Most Jews are basically gone. Maybe you're lucky if a Jew is traditional. But basically the overwhelming majority of Jewish people are gone. They sin. So therefore, God has to do something which is called Tachas B'nai. Instead of Isaac, Yitzhak, instead of the Jews being annihilated, he has to exercise a tremendous amount of emergency actions. And the question then is, what are they? So let's take a look. 1. In order to make sure that the Jews can be redeemed, right, and they won't slip into a level where redemption is not possible, the Rebbe has to start, believe it or not, the messianic process. Because if he waits, there won't be a messianic process. There's nobody to redeem. You see? Because the Jews have slipped into the lowest level, and therefore they are no longer worthy of being redeemed. Therefore, what God wants to do is he wants to start the actual messianic process in order to slow or to block the descent of the Jews into the lowest level, which is remarkable, you see. So that's the first thing that God has to do. The second thing is that God wants to diminish the culpability or the guilt of the Jews as they sin, even in this generation. That's a very important idea, that God wants to diminish the culpability, like I say, the guilt that the Jews have, even though they sin. You see? And then how does he do that? By creating a terrible situation of ignorance and darkness, where there's not much religion. You see, as I will point out and explain, it's tremendously dark today. We live in a society which is incredibly confusing. Everybody's trying to pander their belief, their values, you see. And we live in societies the world over, and all kinds of ideologies that say that they are the truth. So after a while, you don't know what's happening. You don't know what is the MS. What is the right way to live? You see, because everybody's got their version of how to live correctly. That's tremendous chishach, or darkness. And we live in a world that there are so many variations, so many alternatives, competition of what is the proper lifestyle. I would just go to any library or read any magazine, and everybody's espousing different lifestyles. And after a while, you walk away and say, I don't know, what is the real lifestyle? What is the purpose of the world? What is the purpose of creation? You see? Is there a God? What does God want? And so on. Maybe formerly life was so simple, what is good and what is bad was so clear. Today, that itself is subject to an enormous amount of debate. What does it mean to be good? What demonstrates goodness? What does it mean to be bad? What demonstrates bad and evil? There are so many people out there that believe that evil is good, or they think that what they want to do, which is really evil, is good, right? And there's so many things that if you want to do good, people say, no, that's an evil. There's an unbelievable of confusion out there. You see, that's all part of the incredible darkness that we live in, you see. And God increases that darkness. Why? Because then a person can have what's called an insanity play, or this time you can call it an ignorance play, where a person can say to God, well, what do you want from me? Everything is so incredibly confusing. Why am I guilty of anything? And on the contrary, that will minimize or diminish his guilt if he does sin. So God does want to introduce that to help the Jews that do sin. Third thing, tachas benoi. The third idea that God has to bring a substitute in order to redeem the Jews is he has to increase the suffering to satisfy justice, you see. And the suffering, of course, acts as a major vehicle for kapara, a major vehicle in order that a person should be able to atone for his sins. So suffering at a tremendously heightened level is required to satisfy justice. Another idea, fourth idea, is God needs certain people. They are called the sovlei chiloim, those who bear sicknesses, that they will accept upon themselves part of the suffering of the Jewish people, which, by the way, is allowed. Since Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, is really one, it is possible for somebody to atone by suffering for the rest of the Jewish people, yes. But obviously you have to be a tremendous neshama, a very great neshama. And these people that suffer for the sake of the Jewish people, to accept some of the suffering, they are called the sovlei chiloim. You see, and there are many of them. Moshe Rabbeinu is one of them. By being buried outside of Eretz Yisrael, his neshama is denied a tremendous amount of holiness that it would be subject to. But it's not, in order that when the neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu suffers, the Jews have a tremendous atonement. And that's, by the way, he is buried outside Eretz Yisrael. That illustrates or demonstrates the suffering that he has accepted upon himself for the Jews to be able to survive. Besides him, the next ones who are the greatest are the Meshichim. Mashiach ben Yosef, as I will demonstrate, and Mashiach ben David. They also suffer for the Jewish people. That's called the Yisur Mashiach, you see, in order to help the Jews survive. And throughout the generations, there are many tzaddikim, really great men, who suffer. And the suffering that they go through isn't for their own sins. In fact, one of the requirements is that you cannot suffer because of your own sins. You have to be really free of suffering for any sin that you did. You did it, you didn't do any sins. Only those type of people can suffer for others, for the Jewish people. So God needs them to accept part of the suffering that the Jews would have to accept, and therefore they can survive. Then you have, besides them, you have misa tzaddikim. Many times a tzaddik, he will die young, or he will have tremendous problems, of a personal nature, and so on. And that is also in order to help bring a kapara to the Jewish people, as we learn that a misa tzaddik, that when a righteous person dies, in some way that alleviates the culpability of the Jewish people. That's called the misa tzaddikim, you see. And then another tachas benoi strategy is that evil has to succeed, not only to increase darkness, but in order to provide a bribe, which I mentioned last time in my shir, to the Sultan. Because the Sultan does not want any of this, basically. Certainly that a Mashiach, a messianic process should ensue. Doesn't want that, obviously. But when God says, okay, I'm going to allow your people to succeed, all the evil people to succeed, so the Sultan then reasons to himself, this is fine. I gave the previous shir about that. Okay, because I'm hoping that these people will make the Jews go into the 50th level of Tumah, and therefore they will not be redeemed at all. You see, any case, that's it. Those are the 6 different types of emergency measures that God takes when the Jews are in a situation, which is the Memtesh Shari Tumah, the 49th level of evil, and they are immersed in that environment, and they themselves, the overwhelming majority, have nothing to do with Judaism, and they are just simply disappearing. These are the 6 measures, as I mentioned. Okay. Now, let's take a look. The Kulam Zakoim, when did that happen? When all Jews were righteous? Well, the truth is that really happened on Purim. All the Jews fasted for 3 days, which is Tainus Esther, right? And because of that, the Jewish people as a whole reached a tremendous level of holiness and purity, you see. And therefore, that Zakoim was so great that really Mashiach ben Yosef should have come then. Who was the Mashiach ben Yosef in that generation? It was Ezra HaSofer. Ezra, he's a Kohen. He really was a candidate of Shoresh of Mashiach ben Yosef. And had he come back with the entire Jewish people, then he would have been Mashiach ben Yosef. And the way you see that is because it says Roi Torah, that the Torah was could have been given through Ezra HaSofer, not through Moshe Rabbeinu. Because Ezra HaSofer also was a Shoresh, a root of the Messianic soul, specifically Mashiach ben Yosef, even though he was a Kohen, which I once mentioned, and so on. And therefore, the Jews almost came to the time of the Messianic era. But the problem was that only 70,000 Jews returned with Ezra, and therefore the Messianic era never happened. But that was a time that was Kulam Zakoim, you see. Now, what about Kulam Chayovim? When the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people are sinners, which is also, as I mentioned, when Mashiach comes, okay? Well, you had basically 3 times that happened. The first time was the Mabul, where the world had reached the level of the 49th level of Tumah, right? And we know that. So, therefore, because of that, at that time, the world was in danger of reaching the 50th level. So what God did is he pressed the restart button at that time, which means that the Mabul killed everybody on the planet, with the exception of Noach, his sons, and their wives, and so on, you see? And that was a time again that God had to take emergency measures in order for the world to survive. The second time that it happened, which I will get into later, was Egypt, Mitzrayim. Chazal tell us, the rabbis tell us, that at the time of Egypt, you see, at the time of Egypt, the Jews had reached the 49th level of Tumah, of defilement, and they were in danger of slipping into the 50th. And that is why the Rebbe Shem, as we will see, began the Messianic process. Moshe Rabbeinu, you see. And Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, was the Mashiach, or the greatest. He was a candidate of the Mashiach, actually. So that was the second time we find that God took emergency measures, which I will explain, at the time of Egypt. The third time, which I believe is now, is the world as we are now. That the environment of the world is the 49th level of defilement. That's the world we live in. In fact, we're so immersed in that, we don't even realize how bad things are in terms of its enormous contrast and opposition to real spirituality and holiness and righteousness. That's how inured we have become, you see. And therefore, I believe, as we will see, that God also has taken emergency measures. What is that? That he has begun the Messianic process with the election of Donald Trump as the Tov Shebe'esav. Because in this generation, the way to begin the Messianic era is the good part of Esav now changing and helping the Jewish people. You see. So let me go back to some of the ideas, which is the emergency steps that God takes. And what we now begin to understand is that the reason why the messianic process can begin is because we are so close to the end in terms of sinning into the 50th level of Tumah. That's why. And that is one of the ways that the Mashiach comes, because it's a crisis. And if we slip into the 50th, that's it. It's over with. So therefore, that itself, in a certain sense, forces God to end the entire era of civilization by bringing the Mashiach. You see. Now, one of the ways I mentioned is what's called the Sovli Chiloim. Those people that accept the sufferings in order to alleviate the guilt of the Jewish people. And one of the greatest of these people is called Mashiach ben Yosef. And I will mention Yalkut Shimoni in Sefer Yeshayahu, okay, in section 499. It talks about the Mashiach ben Yosef. There it calls the Mashiach ben Yosef, Mashiach ben Ephraim. It's Yalkut Shimoni. And here's what it says, that in the beginning of time, God spoke to the Mashiach ben Yosef, or that neshama that would be the Mashiach ben Yosef. It actually says, this is the Medrash, and said to him that in the future, your people will be chayav, will be obligated, kliya, destruction. Yes, the Jews will have to die. They will have to be annihilated. This is what God tells the Mashiach ben Yosef. Now, does he mean all the Jewish people? No. But he means a sufficient amount where it's incredibly tragic news. So the Mashiach ben Yosef says to him, this is part of the Medrash, that wait a minute, then what I will do is I will accept upon myself, this is what he says, a tremendous amount of suffering to help alleviate the suffering or the sins of the Jews. Because the problem is that the sins of the Jewish people will be so numerous, right, that they cannot expiate the sins in a given lifetime, you see. So therefore they will have to be annihilated. Because there is no time sufficient to expiate their sins. So the Mashiach ben Yosef says, okay, then I will accept upon myself the suffering of all Jews who live at my time and all Jews who ever lived. Could you imagine what he's accepting? I will accept upon myself the suffering, and that will help alleviate their kapara or create their atonement. So God says, fine, because that's what God needs. Somebody to help alleviate and to partake of that suffering, to remove the annihilation decree against the Jews. So God places, the Medrash says, a tremendous iron yoke, an iron yoke that they put on top of oxen. And that iron yoke represents the suffering that the Jews would have to expiate their sins, you see. And it says that the Mashiach ben Yosef bends because the weight is unbelievable. And he starts screaming and he says, I can't bear this. I'm only a human, flesh and blood. I can't possibly bear this type of iniquity, to resolve or take suffering for this iniquity of the Jewish people. So God says, yes, but you promised. So God says, together with you, I also, God says, my divine presence will go into the Golus, the exile with the Jews. So then the Mashiach ben Yosef says, okay, if you also will accept upon yourself this suffering of the Shechina, it's called Shechint Begalusa, the divine presence itself is in Golus, without getting into that, then I will also accept it. So therefore you see several very important ideas that God says that in the end of time, the Jews will have to be annihilated. That's what he says. And that is the Kulum Chayavim, because they're all guilty of death, because most of the Jews are gone. Based on the measuring stick of God. That's the first thing we see. And the second thing we see is that the Mashiach ben Yosef is one of the people that accepts their suffering. You see. Now, in what ways does the Mashiach ben Yosef suffer? Well, we know it says at the end of the Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu blesses each Shevet, he says, B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox. Hodoloi, he's blessing the tribe of Yosef. And he says, B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox. Hodoloi, beauty is his. Okay? V'kani re'em kanov, and the horns of this ox is not the horns of an ox, which is short and strong. It is the horns of a re'em, which has magnificent horns. If you ever look at some deers or goats, how their horns are shaped, beautiful in its shape and pattern. Okay, that's the horns of this ox, not the horns of an ox, but the horns of Re'em. And then it says in the pasuk, in the end, V'zois habracha, right? Ubehem amyim yanagach, and with these horns he will go the nations. That is the weapons of the Mashiach ben Yosef to bring about an incredible change. And now the question, of course, is what does that mean? Obviously, it's a metaphor. So here's what it means. Moshe Rabbeinu says, B'chor Shoiroi, the firstborn of his ox, the firstborn of the ox of Yosef. Right? Who is that? That's the Mashiach ben Yosef. Hodoloi. He's beautiful. He's magnificent to look at. How? You see? V'kani re'em kanov. In other words, the horns of this ox, right, is not the horns of an ox. It's the horns of a re'em. Beautiful horns. The way they shape and configure. What does that mean? Because what are horns? Horns are weapons. And they emanate from the head of the ox or the animal. The same idea. The weapons of the Mashiach ben Yosef also emanates from his head. What weapons are that? Are they? That's chokhmah, wisdom. Incredible wisdom. That's beautiful to look at. And it is with this wisdom that the Mashiach ben Yosef is going to grow the nations. What kind of wisdom is that? That is the messianic light. The Or HaGanuz, the messianic light, the hidden light, the Or Mashiach, or the Or Rishon, the first light. That's really what it is. So with that light, with that chokhmah, with that wisdom, incredible ideas, that is how he's going to convince the world, right, that it's all spiritual. Everything is connected to and emanates from God. That is the essential task of the Mashiach, you see. But when the Mashiach accepted suffering, he accepted it with his horns, you see, to be suspended, to be blocked, you see. And that's what the suffering of the Mashiach ben Yosef is that here's a guy that has unbelievable spiritual potential, incredible chokhmah, wisdom, and there is no way that he can express that chokhmah. It is blocked, concealed, and that is unbelievably painful. And now you understand what it says in the Akedah, that Avraham Avinu looked around and he saw an ayil, a ram, and that ram is symbolic of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And then it says that ram was entangled in a bush, bikarnov, with its horns. That ram is symbolic of the Mashiach ben Yosef. And what is entangled? What is blocked? Its horns, which is the chokhmah. You see? And therefore, that ayil, which is the Mashiach ben Yosef, that was placed on the Mizbeach, the altar that Yitzhak was removed from, and he is sacrificing himself for the betterment, for the kapara of Klal Yisrael. You see? So that ayil really refers to the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see? And suffers by the inability of expressing his unbelievable righteousness and his unbelievable chokhmah. So that is the first thing that is tachas benoi. It's a substitute for the Yitzhak, in order for Yitzhak to be freed. You see. Now, so that's one idea, which I mentioned, one action that God has to take. A second action, in order for the Jews not to descend into the 50th, because it's Kulam Chayam, right? God has to begin the messianic process, you see. So the Jews don't descend, and they can actually have the messianic process, even though the majority of the Jewish people are gone. What is this? Well, in today's time, right, we see that the messianic process starts with Edom, Esav, doing tshuva, you see. So when it says Rav Yavoy Tzoyer, that the older will serve the younger, right? That's Esav will be a brother to Yaakov, and he will serve Yaakov. You see, I had mentioned that this in many ways is what Trump's doing. That's the Toiv Sheba Esav that is now seeking to help the Jewish people. And we see that. Look what he's done. We know that when Esav does tshuva, Esav says to Yaakov, Yehiluch Hasheloch, let that which is yours be yours. And Rashi says that Esav said that the blessings which that you took from Yitzhak, they are yours. You can take them. You can keep them. That's the tshuva of Esav, you see? And that is what Trump has done. Trump has made Jerusalem the capital. Automatically it means that Israel isn't, the Jewish people are entitled to the state of Israel. He has moved the embassy to Israel. He has now said the Golan is now Israel. He's taken away any violation of international law in the territories. Look what he's done. He's restoring the land of Israel to the Jewish people. That's number one. This is messianic. Second idea is take a look what's happening. While he's under such terrible persecutions, look what he's doing with the Arabs. You have one Arab after the other that want to ally themselves, right, with the Jewish people, right? We have the UAE, United Arab Emirates, we have Bahrain, we have Sudan, now we have Morocco, right? And we have other countries that are lining up to ally themselves with the Jewish people. This is the tshuva of Yishmael. And who's the one who's responsible for that? Obviously, the one who's responsible for that is Trump, of course, which he gets absolutely no credit for. But this is all messianic. This never happened before, you see. Now, besides of that, we have another action that God takes. What is that? And that is the diminishment, to diminish their culpability, and therefore to allow them to survive. That's something else that God takes in order to allow the Jews, like I say, to survive. And how? Because he increases tremendously the darkness. So the Jews can plead ignorance. Well, we didn't know. Look how dark out there is. Look how it is out there. Look how much ignorance there is out there. And that diminishes, that lowers the culpability of the Jewish people. And he does that also by allowing evil to increase. Because people who are evil will increase the darkness. And that is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get rid of the Rash of Esav, the evil part of Esav, which is basically the establishment, you see, in Washington, and the media, Democratic Party, and so on. Because they increase evil, lies, untruths enormously, and that is tremendously confusing. That's also one of the reasons why the Erev Rav, those Jews that want to destroy the bond that a Jew has with the Torah, okay, the Jewish nation has with the Torah, that's why it's so hard to get rid of them. Because what they do is by increasing the darkness, the choshech in the land of Israel and wherever they are, right, they enormously diminish the light, the truth. And therefore, people who sin and now have diminished amount of guilt. That's why it's so difficult to remove the Erev Rav. And that also explains another concept, where the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, there are many Amoraim that said in the Gemara, ye say, let the Mashiach come, v'lo yechmini, but I don't want to see it. For instance, Rabbi Yochanan. What were they afraid of? Why would anybody say that let the Mashiach come, but I don't want to see it? And the answer is because they knew that the Mashiach is going to come in a time when the Jews are chayom, right at the mem test, the 49th level of defilement. And one of the ways that God has to save the Jews is by allowing enormous amount of darkness and ignorance, amaratzis, to increase among the Jewish people. That's called miut or, the diminishment of light. And they cannot stand that. A tzaddik cannot stand the diminishment of spirituality, righteousness, justice, and the light of the Torah. They can't do that. And they knew that the way that the Mashiach ben Yosef is going to come is through, right? Is through the Tachas Benoi, to save the Jews, which is the increase of darkness. So they will have some type of a plea to remove a lot of the guilt that they have, because they could say, I didn't know, you see? And that's one of the reasons why, as the generations goes on, there's no tzaddikim left. There are hardly any gedolim left. You don't see the amount of gedolim that we used to see in Europe and before that. You take a look at America or Eretz Yisrael, how many real gedolim are there now? Hardly any. Again, because that's the diminishment or the increase of evil and darkness. And that's also another reason why you see in this generation of, or this world, year of COVID, why so many Jews have died, but not only the regular Jewish people, but so many Jews, tzaddikim, righteous people, kedoshim, holy rebbes, rosh yeshivas, b'nai Torah, why so many of them have died. Because that's part of the diminishment, or I should say the increase tremendously of darkness, you see. So therefore the Jews have a claim as being, in a certain sense, not as guilty, you see. This is all going on because the Mashiach is coming, not because we deserve it now, because the tikkun is complete. It's because we are all chayovim. That's why Mashiach, in order to make sure we don't descend into the 50th, therefore these things must happen. Then we have another idea called suffering, you see, and that is for the atonement itself. That's why there are so many COVID deaths. There are so many deaths from COVID. And not only that, there's pachad mavis, there's a fear of a death of COVID, which itself is a kapara, you see. And then there's social instabilities, social disruptions. All of this is frightening, incredibly anxiety-provoking. And then there are the lockdowns, the economic poverty. I mean, there are people that are tremendously suffering in terms of poverty. They don't have enough money to live, to eat, or whatever. You see, and how many businesses will never reopen. And then there's the loss of liberty, and so on. All of this is tremendous suffering. But it's interesting, not just to the Jewish people, it's also to the entire world. Why? Because when the Mashiach will come, it's not only the Jews will benefit, which are the main beneficiaries, but the ones who will benefit enormously are the non-Jews, the Goyim, because it will be the Messianic era. And the Messianic era is an era of unparalleled success, light, you see, health. Every good thing you can imagine will be in the Messianic era. And they too must deserve it. So the suffering also encompasses them also. You see. Then I mentioned also, you see, that the increase of sin and the fact that evil is allowed to be successful, all those peoples that represent evil, is also to allow the Satan not to mekatreg, not to prosecute, because he's hoping that if you allow all this evil to increase, that will destroy, or that will push the Jews into the 50th level of Tumah. So he says, okay. Even though on the other side, it decreases the culpability of the Jews. You see, so we now understand. So let's take a look now. We know that the model of the redemption is what happened in Egypt. As it says, He inequality eschem achas gracious. Behold, that the last redemption, which is now, will be like the first, which is Egypt. And there Chazal explicitly tell us that the Jews were in the Memtes, were in the 49th level of evil. And again, there you are, Kurum Chayom. The problem then is that they're going to slip into the 50th, right? And they cannot be redeemed. And all the Jews basically in Egypt worship idols. Therefore, the Baruch Shem said, I have to send the Mashiach now, so they don't descend into the 50th. And therefore, by the sneh, which is the burning bush. He designated Moshe Rabbeinu to go, right, in order to stop their descent. He actually brought the Mashiach to the Jewish people, even though they're Kulam Chayobim. You see. And therefore, but wait a minute, you can't just redeem the Jews. Tachas Benoi. There has to be a substitute that will enable Yitzhak to get off the altar. There has to be something that will enable the Jews to do what? To be redeemed. You see, because it's Kulam Chayobim. And the answer is straw. That Paroi decreed, not only will I defy you, he says, who is God, that I have to listen, but I will, not only that, but I will show you that they're my slaves. And not only do I not have to redeem them, but they're even my slaves, and I will intensify the slavery, right? By saying that not only do they have to build bricks with straw, but they actually have to gather the straw at night, which is terrible because that means they couldn't even sleep. So that decree of straw enormously intensified the slavery and the suffering of the Jewish people. And that was part of the decree, of course, of suffering that would enable Moshe Rabbeinu to really be the Mashiach, you see. And then, of course, God redeemed them, the Makkahs, you see. And, of course, as a result of that, that was the Tachas Benoi, is the decree of straw, and that was what got the Jews out of Egypt. Now, just like what happened in Egypt, it will happen today, that the Mashiach will come in a generation of Kulam Chayobim. And like I said, that's why many Amoraim, Rabbi Yochanan and so on, that's why they said, we don't want to be there. Why? Because we know that the Tachas Benoi, the substitute for the redemption, is going to be unbelievable darkness in order to remove the culpability of the Jewish people. We cannot live in such a generation, you see. And therefore, that's exactly what's happening now. That's why even though God has begun the messianic process with an individual like Trump, the Tev Shebeisav, you see, he has also instituted all the other strategies, which is collectively called Tachas Benoi, those things that have to substitute or have to be in place in order for Yitzhak to leave, in order for the Jews to be redeemed by the Mashiach, which God sends, right? Not Mashiach literally, but the messianic process, right? He wants to do what? He wants to institute many things which I've gone through, and so on. The darkness and the suffering increases, and the diminishment, the increase of evil, and allow evildoers to increase, and so on. So therefore, this is what we're seeing. This, therefore, we see is a messianic interruption. That even though God is bringing the Mashiach, he's stopping it. Why? Because the reason why he's bringing the Mashiach isn't because the Jews deserve the Mashiach. It's because they're about to falter and fall into the 50th gate of what? Of defilement. That's why he's bringing the Mashiach. Just like the same idea in Egypt, you see. But in order to bring the Mashiach, then you must have a Tachas Benoi. You have to have a substitute that will remove all the other problems that the Jews have, because they are in the 49th level of defilement. And that's why it seems as if the whole messianic process, everything that Trump has done, has stopped. And he himself is about to be evicted from the presidency. You see, it will be very interesting to see what happens. Now, there are signs that hopefully it will end in a good way. First of all, God has allowed many vaccines, not just one, but many. So apparently, he seems to have, what he seems to be doing is he wants to remove the suffering brought about by COVID, not only for the Jewish people, but for the entire world. And that's a good sign, because he could have had only one organization discovering a vaccine, but he didn't. There are at least two now, and I hear even in England there's a third, and there are many others in line, you see. So there's going to be many, many vaccines out there. So God wants to really end the whole plague, if you want to use that word, of COVID. So that's a very good thing. Second very good thing, which indicates that the Tachas Benoi may be ending, is the Arabs, where many Arab nations want to line up and make peace with Israel as allies, You see, so that itself is the beginning of the end of what's called the Clip of Yishmael, that the Arabs and Muslims themselves are now aligning themselves with the Jewish people. Another very good thing, right, to remove the Erev Rav. There's an individual, his name is Gideon Sa'ar, who I hope will become prime minister. I've been saying this for several years already, predicting it and so on. And that is that he has now gone into his own party, and he's now running to be prime minister. And I believe that if he will be prime minister, which I believe he will stop the Erev Rav, and he will terminate the power of the Erev Rav to destroy the Jewish people and to keep them incredibly ignorant, you see. Another very good thing is Israel's rise amongst the nations. I mean, Israel used to be looked at as a pariah nation. Now everybody realizes Israel is not a pariah nation. Israel is not even a normal nation. It is a super nation. That's what people realize. This nation of 9 million people is beyond belief. This cannot be explained with a normal course of history. This is divine. A nation should be so gifted and should be so forward in so many fields of endeavor is incredible. You see, and what do they have, only 9 million people? That itself is messianic. And I'm hoping, of course, that Trump is going to do something where he will regain the presidency. You see. And I'd just like to make one comment before I end this year, and it's my personal opinion. Trump has to do something. I don't think he understands, and I wish I could tell him. What is that? Trump took an oath of office. That oath of office, okay, has tremendous amount of weight to it. What was the oath? The greatest oath of office is that he will defend the Constitution. The Constitution is the entire basis of the rule of law in the United States. If you remove that, that's the end of the law and order. It's the end of the rule of law. And he took an oath to defend the Constitution. And we all know, clearly, I'm not even going into the fraudulent elections, but we all know that states have violated the Constitution. And not only have they violated the Constitution, okay, but they have violated their own state constitutions. Therefore, he's enjoined by his own oath to defend the Constitution. And I believe what that means is he has to be what he is, the commander-in-chief. He is legally empowered, not only by the Insurrection Act, but by, I think it's an executive order in 2018, that he will defend the Constitution against all enemies, whether foreign or domestic. If he believes that the elections is a fraud, and he believes that, with all the evidence that he has gathered and so on, then he has the moral right, and he must impound every Dominion machine and count it to see if it's fraudulent. He has to, he has to also audit every vote and disqualify all the illegal votes. He has to do that. He doesn't understand. He has no choice, because he took an oath to defend the Constitution. And if he believes that the Constitution has been violated, then he must do it. He has no choice. He keeps talking about the Supreme Court having courage. Excuse me, where's your courage? You took an oath of office that you have to defend the Constitution. Once you break the law, it's over with. Then everybody will make a mockery of the Constitution. So what are you talking about the Supreme Court and the courts having? They've already, they're all basically traitors to the Constitution, because they're going to sit by and allow this to happen. There are 4 victims of this. 1, Trump. He's the first victim of the fraudulent elections. The second victim is that 74 million people that voted for him, they have been disenfranchised, right, from their votes have been disenfranchised. The next victims are the other Democrats, because there are many Democrats, they don't want to win this way. They want a fair election, you see. I don't know how many there are, but there are. Not everybody is a thug. People who are dishonest and so on. But there are many Democratic voters that realize, what kind of business is this? There's hanky-panky going on here. We don't want this. If we win, we want it to be fair and righteous, a fair and open election. And who's the fourth victim? People don't realize. The entire world is a victim. Why? Because God needs a nation that represents justice and righteousness. Yes, he needs a model. And the model always was the United States. And now that America comes across like Venezuela, like a banana republic, could you imagine what the mockery is? America, don't tell us what to do. You yourself have violated your own laws. You see? America is making a mockery of what America used to stand for. You see? So even the world is the victim of what is happening now. Listen, what's the big deal? Why can't the courts or the Congress or whatever say, listen, we cannot allow 74 million people to say that Biden is an illegitimate president? It's the end of the United States. So what we are going to do, let's find out if he is legitimate. We'll make sure that 6 states have to have an election, right? Again, whatever. We're going to, let's impound the Dominion machines, right? Let's take a look at all the votes that are legal or illegal. Just do it. How long will it take? 2-3 days? What's the big deal? But at least everybody will know that if Biden won, then he truly won. Nobody's going to argue with that. You see? This is what they have to do. Why don't they want to do it? Why do they want to make sure that 74 million people will look at Biden as a crook? Which, by the way, he is. Take a look what his son did, Hunter, and that he was on the take with China. I'm not even going into Biden, what he is, and so on. But why don't they do this? They have to do it to defend the honor of the United States and the legitimacy of the United States as a just and true nation, you see, that follows the rule of law. What's the big deal? How long will it take? A couple of days with no mail-in ballots? Of course, but they don't want to do it. Why? Because they're all a bunch of crooks. They are dishonest people. That's why. Think about that. What is the big deal? Because they don't care. And what they do is threaten the reputation of the United States. They threaten the legitimacy of any president of Biden and so on, right? They deny Trump his victory, you see? And more than that, this is not just this election. That means nobody respects the Constitution anymore. They have set a precedent that the Constitution can be broken and violated without any consequences. You see? That's the end of the reputation of America. How can any American tolerate that? You see? So the whole Congress, if they were honest, truly honest, right, and upright, they would demand all of these, the impounded machines, have audit the votes, or have them vote all over again, just those 6 states. Think about that more. What I'm saying is, this is not, you don't have to be a genius to say this. You see? Seichelding. This is logical, but they don't want to do it because that's the evil that America is turning into. You see, you want to have an election? Prove or make sure that the election itself was open, fair, and honest and just. Don't do this because you endanger the future of America. Because if this happens, again, it's over with. And not only that, there are states that may, I'm not saying they will, but they may secede from the Union. Because nobody wants to be a socialist country. Nobody has the right to turn America from what it was for hundreds of years into a communist, socialist country, because that's what they think is important, their values, which is absurd, you see? So for the sake of America to continue, as it always has been, as a model for the entire world, which is what God wants, you see, they must deal with the crisis of the American elections. Certainly that it should not be fraudulent, but certainly it's not only fraudulence of the elections. They have to deal with the fact that states violated the Constitution of the United States, and they violated their own constitutions, the state constitutions, which is the rule of law and order. For their sake, let them be courageous and stand up for the truth, and they will be forever blessed by God. Let's hope that that's what happens, and I believe that if they do that, that America will restore and recapture its tremendous, pristine reputation, which is critical. And I also believe that Trump will continue to be the president. Thank you.